Power wasn't just taken in the ancient world, it was seized, often with a blade in the dark. The Roman historian Tacitus once wrote, "The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws." But he could have just as easily said, "The more coveted the throne, the more frequent the assassinations." From the shadowed halls of Rome to the gilded courts of Persia, the pursuit of power was a deadly game, and the stakes were always life or death. Imagine a world where a single whispered conspiracy could topple an empire, where loyalty was fleeting, and where the quickest path to the throne wasn't through diplomacy or battle, but through cold, calculated murder. This was the brutal reality of ancient politics, where ambition knew no bounds, and bloodshed was just another tool in the arsenal of power. Why did so many rulers meet such violent ends? What drove their rivals, sometimes even their closest allies, to commit acts of treachery that would echo through history? The answers lie in the stories we're about to uncover, 30 of the most shocking, cunning, and consequential assassinations the ancient world ever witnessed. These weren't just murders, they were seismic events that reshaped kingdoms, ignited wars, and altered the course of civilizations. Some were acts of vengeance, others desperate grabs for control, but all reveal the same chilling truth. In the fight for supremacy, morality often crumbled beneath the weight of ambition. As we journey through these tales, you'll encounter betrayals that would make even the most hardened conspirator shudder. Plots hatched in secret, daggers wielded by trusted hands, and the eerie calm before the storm of chaos. You'll meet emperors who ruled with iron fists, only to fall to the very violence they once commanded, and schemers who rose from obscurity to claim power through sheer audacity. This isn't just a recounting of history's darkest moments. It's an exploration of the human psyche at its most ruthless, a reminder of how far people will go when the prize is absolute control. So prepare to step into the shadows where every alliance is fragile, every smile could hide a dagger, and where the line between ruler and victim was often thinner than a blade's edge. The Game of Thrones was deadly, and these are the moves that changed the world. Power in the ancient world wasn't just about crowns or titles. It was a fragile illusion, constantly under siege. Unlike modern governments with clear rules of succession, ancient kingdoms often had no orderly way to pass authority from one ruler to the next. This uncertainty turned every throne into a battleground, where even blood relatives could become mortal enemies overnight. In Rome, the Praetorian Guard, once sworn to protect the emperor, became infamous for auctioning the throne to the highest bidder. Persia's royal courts were no safer, where siblings poisoned one another to eliminate rivals before their father's body was even cold. What made these regimes so unstable? Without written laws or impartial judges, power belonged to whoever could seize and hold it by any means necessary. Loyalty was a currency spent freely but rarely honored. A trusted general might lead your armies one day and plot your murder the next. A beloved advisor could smile to your face while slipping venom into your wine. Even family offered no sanctuary. Sons deposed fathers, wives betrayed husbands, and brothers turned on brothers in ruthless bids for control. Take Rome's Year of the Four Emperors, where Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian rose and fell in rapid succession, each meeting a violent end. Or consider Persia's King Artaxerxes III, who secured his reign by systematically executing every potential challenger, including most of his own relatives. These weren't exceptions, they were the brutal norms of an era where power was a prize wrested from the dead hands of the previous ruler. And so we come to our first assassination, a crime so shocking it reverberated across centuries. Picture a conqueror at the height of his glory, returning from battle to celebrate his triumphs, only to be struck down not by foreign enemies, but by those who shared his own table. The dagger's edge was swift, but the betrayal cut deeper. The Roman Senate was eerily quiet on the 15th of March, 44 BCE, a day history would remember as the Ides of March. Julius Caesar, fresh from his military triumphs and basking in the title of dictator for life, strode into the chamber unaware that 60 senators, including men he considered friends, had secretly sharpened their daggers. Among them stood Marcus Brutus, a man Caesar had pardoned and trusted like a son. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators crowded around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Then, in a flurry of movement, the first blade struck. The assassination was meticulously planned. Each conspirator had agreed to plunge their dagger into Caesar, ensuring no single individual bore full blame, a chilling display of shared guilt. Legend claims Caesar's last words were not the dramatic "et tu, Brute," but a stunned gasp as he recognized Brutus among his attackers. The murder wasn't just about removing a leader, it was a desperate attempt to save the Roman Republic from what the conspirators saw as tyranny. They believed Caesar's unchecked power would destroy centuries of tradition, replacing the Senate's authority with one-man rule. Yet their noble rhetoric masked a darker truth. Many conspirators weren't motivated by ideals but by personal grievances. Caesar had humiliated rivals, redistributed wealth, and bypassed the elite to appeal directly to the people. His reforms threatened the status quo and the privileges of Rome's aristocracy. The assassins saw themselves as liberators, but their act didn't restore the Republic. Instead, it unleashed chaos. The public, who had adored Caesar, turned their fury on the conspirators, forcing them to flee Rome. Within weeks, the city descended into civil war, proving that violence, once unleashed, rarely stops with a single stroke. Was Caesar's murder justified? History remains divided. Some argue it was a necessary defense of republican values. Others see it as the desperate act of men unwilling to share power. What's undeniable is the irony. The killers sought to prevent dictatorship, yet their actions paved the way for Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, to become Rome's first true emperor. The Ides of March didn't save the Republic, it buried it, and as the dust settled, a new lesson echoed through the ancient world. Eliminating a leader doesn't erase the forces that put him in power. It only invites the next contender to step forward, dagger in hand. The bloodshed didn't end with Caesar. If anything, his death became a blueprint for future conspiracies, proof that even the mightiest could fall to betrayal. And in the shadows of another empire, far from Rome, a similar plot was brewing. The grand celebration in Agis should have been Philip II's finest hour. Fresh from uniting Greece under Macedonian rule and poised to launch an invasion of Persia, the king strode into the theater surrounded by cheering crowds, his bodyguards momentarily relaxed, his enemies seemingly pacified. Then, in a flash of steel, a lone assassin named Pausanias lunged. The dagger found its mark, and Europe's most powerful ruler crumpled to the ground. Within moments, the man who had spent decades forging an empire was dead, his dreams of conquering Persia extinguished with a single, brutal stroke. What drove Pausanias to commit such an audacious act? The official story painted it as a crime of passion, a personal vendetta. Years earlier, Philip had allegedly allowed Pausanias to be assaulted by his own courtiers after the young man spurned the advances of a powerful general. Humiliated and denied justice, Pausanias supposedly waited years for his moment of revenge, but whispers of a deeper conspiracy swirled from the start. Philip's ambitious new wife, Olympias, and their 20-year-old son, Alexander, stood to gain everything from his death. Had someone encouraged Pausanias' rage, knowing it would clear the path for Alexander's rise. The aftermath was telling. Alexander moved with ruthless efficiency, securing the throne by eliminating potential rivals, including his own cousin. Within 2 years, he'd crossed into Persia, fulfilling his father's vision on an unimaginable scale. History remembers Alexander the Great, but Philip's murder raises haunting questions. Did the very brilliance he cultivated in his son indirectly doom him? His court had been a nest of intrigue, where wives, advisors, and foreign dignitaries jockeyed for influence. In the end, the king who mastered the battlefield couldn't defend himself from the knives of his own household. Royal families often proved their own undoing. From Macedonia's palaces to the Nile's dynasties, blood ties meant little when power was at stake. And nowhere was this truth more evident than in the next assassination, a plot so twisted it would make even Philip's killers blanch. Rome's third emperor, Caligula, began his rule with promise, a young leader hailed as the darling of the legions after growing up in military camps. But within 4 years, the Senate and people of Rome would whisper a very different name behind closed doors: the monster. His descent into cruelty was as swift as it was shocking. He emptied the treasury on absurd spectacles, declared himself a living god, and allegedly planned to appoint his horse as a consul. Yet it wasn't his extravagance that sealed his fate, it was the terror he inflicted on Rome's elite. Senators were forced to run beside his chariot like slaves. Others were executed on a whim, their property seized to fund his excesses. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's most feared protectors, grew weary of his erratic purges. The conspiracy to remove Caligula wasn't led by foreign enemies or distant rivals. It festered in his inner circle. Cassius Chaerea, a high-ranking officer in the Guard, had endured years of humiliation. The emperor mocked his voice, assigning him feminine passwords and openly ridiculing him. On January 24, 41 CE, Chaerea and his fellow conspirators struck. As Caligula lingered in a palace corridor after games, the blades fell. The attack was so frenzied that some conspirators accidentally wounded each other in the chaos. When the dust settled, the emperor's body bore over 30 wounds, a testament to the hatred he'd inspired. Public reaction was telling. Unlike Caesar's death, which sparked riots, Rome met Caligula's assassination with eerie silence, then quiet celebration. The Senate even debated restoring the Republic, though the Praetorian Guard swiftly crushed that dream by declaring Caligula's uncle, Claudius, the new emperor. Was this murder justice or mere opportunism? Chaerea claimed noble motives, but the Guard's quick power grab suggests darker calculations. Caligula's reign exposed a grim truth. Absolute power didn't just corrupt it, unraveled minds. And in doing so, it made rulers vulnerable to the very forces meant to protect them. Fear became the constant companion of every emperor who followed. They walked a razor's edge, too weak, and they'd be overthrown, too cruel, and they'd share Caligula's fate. Yet one ruler took this paranoia to new extremes, surrounding himself with a personal army of eunuchs, only to discover that no fortress could stop a blade wielded by someone you've wronged. The torchlight flickered across the walls of Cleopatra's mausoleum as Octavian's soldiers burst inside too late. The last pharaoh of Egypt lay still on her golden couch, clad in royal robes, a serene expression frozen on her face. 2 of her handmaidens slumped beside her, their bodies already growing cold. The scene was staged with theatrical precision. The legendary queen, defeated but unbowed, choosing death over humiliation. Or so the story goes, because when it comes to Cleopatra's demise, history whispers 2 versions, one of defiant suicide, the other of cold-blooded murder. And the truth hinges on a single question: who stood to gain more from her silence? Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, had every motive to ensure Cleopatra never reached Rome as his prisoner. Alive, she was a political liability, a charismatic figurehead who could rally dissent or become a martyr. Dead, she became a cautionary tale, her story reshaped to suit his propaganda. The official account claims she died by the bite of an asp, a symbol of divine royalty in Egypt. Yet skeptics note the absence of a snake in her chamber, the speed of her death, and Octavian's suspiciously swift approval of her burial alongside Mark Antony. Even ancient historians like Plutarch hedged, writing that the method of her death no one knows for certain. Then there's the curious case of her handmaidens. Why would two servants die alongside their queen unless they'd witnessed something unforgivable? Poison, perhaps administered under duress, would explain their synchronized deaths far better than a cobra's whims. And Octavian's own actions after the fact raise eyebrows. He allowed Cleopatra's children to live unusual mercy for a man known for eliminating threats. Unless, of course, their survival served as proof his hands were clean. Cleopatra's death marked more than the fall of Egypt. It underscored the peril faced by women who dared to rule in their own right. From Persia's warrior Queen Artemisia to the Celtic leader Boudicca, female rulers were often vilified or erased by victorious enemies. Their deaths, when recorded at all, were framed as tragedies or moral lessons, never as political calculations. Yet Cleopatra's legacy refused to be buried. Centuries later, her name still conjures images of cunning and defiance, a testament to the power she wielded even in death. And power, as the next assassination proves, was never more dangerous than when it seemed unshakable. High in the Andes, an empire built on conquest would discover that no amount of gold could armor a king against the envy of his own kin. Darius III had once commanded the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Nile to the Indus. His wealth was legendary, his armies countless. Yet by 330 BCE, the Persian king found himself a fugitive in his own realm, fleeing the relentless advance of Alexander the Great. The man who had once presided over glittering ceremonies in Persepolis now slept in borrowed tents, his court reduced to a handful of loyalists, and it was here, in the dusty foothills of modern-day Iran, that betrayal finally caught up with him. Darius's downfall wasn't just the result of Alexander's military genius, it was a slow unraveling of trust. His own satraps, regional governors who had grown weary of his defeats, saw an opportunity. Bessus, the powerful satrap of Bactria, and his conspirators seized the king under cover of darkness, binding him in golden chains, a cruel irony for a ruler whose empire had been built on gilded promises of loyalty. When Alexander's cavalry finally cornered the fleeing Persians, they found Darius slumped in a wagon, mortally wounded by his own men. Some accounts claim Bessus delivered the fatal blow. Others say the king was left to bleed out, abandoned by those who once kissed his ring. Was this murder an act of desperation or cold strategy? Bessus certainly thought he was saving Persia. By eliminating Darius, he could position himself as the empire's last hope against the Macedonian invaders, even declaring himself king under the name Artaxerxes V. But his gamble failed spectacularly. Alexander, far from rewarding the betrayal, hunted Bessus down and executed him as a regicide, using Darius's death to frame himself as the Persian king's rightful avenger and successor. The tragedy of Darius reveals a brutal truth about conquest. Victory rarely belongs to the defeated, but neither does it spare the victors. Alexander's empire, forged through battles and betrayals, would fracture within years of his own death, a proof that bloodshed begets bloodshed. And as one dynasty crumbled, another's rise would be marked by a murder so audacious, It shocked even the most hardened observers. Rome burned for 6 days in 64 CE, its narrow streets choked with smoke and panic. And as the flames devoured entire districts, Emperor Nero stood atop his palace balcony, strumming a lyre, or so the legend claims. Whether this infamous scene was truth or propaganda, one thing was certain: Nero's grip on power was slipping. By 68 CE, the man who had once serenaded himself as a divine artist found his empire in open revolt. Governors declared allegiance to rival claimants, the Praetorian Guard abandoned him, and the Senate, long cowed by his cruelty, finally labeled him a public enemy. Cornered and desperate, Nero fled to a suburban villa with only a handful of freedmen remaining by his side. His last words, whispered as horses' hooves pounded in the distance, were said to be, "What an artist dies in me." Then, with the help of his secretary, he drove a dagger into his own throat. But history has a way of rewriting death scenes, especially when the deceased is as reviled as Nero. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Cassius Dio insist on the suicide narrative, painting it as the cowardly exit of a tyrant, yet whispers of foul play persist. Nero's body was reportedly cremated in secret, with only a handful of loyalists present. The Senate, eager to legitimize his successor, Galba, had every reason to ensure Nero's demise was framed as self-inflicted, a tidy end to a messy reign. Could the dagger have been wielded by another hand? Some accounts note the wound's peculiar angle, suggesting a struggle rather than a deliberate act. And then there's the curious timing. Nero died just as rebels closed in, sparing Rome the spectacle of his trial. The Senate's swift condemnation reveals how quickly alliances shattered when emperors faltered. Nero's reign had been a masterclass in alienating every power base. He taxed the wealthy to fund his artistic indulgences, ignored military concerns, and executed senators on flimsy pretexts. By the end, even his own guards saw him as a liability. His death didn't bring stability, though it kicked off the chaotic year of the 4 emperors, proving that removing a tyrant was easier than replacing him with order. Nero's fate underscores a brutal pattern. Rulers who lost the support of the elite and the army rarely survived long enough to abdicate. And as the next assassination shows, even the most cunning leaders couldn't outrun the consequences of their own excesses. In the sun-baked streets of Carthage, another emperor would learn that no amount of wealth could buy loyalty when the blades came out. The banquet hall of Babylon shimmered with stolen gold on that fateful night in 539 BCE. King Belshazzar, grandson of the mighty Nebuchadnezzar, had ordered a feast using sacred vessels plundered from Jerusalem's temple, a deliberate insult to the god of his conquered enemies. As wine flowed and nobles reveled, a disembodied hand suddenly appeared on the palace wall, etching words no one could decipher. The prophet Daniel, summoned in panic, translated the ominous message, "Min tekel upharsin." Your days are numbered, your kingdom weighed and found wanting. It will be divided. Before dawn, Cyrus the Great's army breached Babylon's supposedly impregnable walls, and Belshazzar lay dead. But was this divine retribution or military strategy? Historical records paint a more nuanced picture. Cyrus, the brilliant tactician, had spent months diverting the Euphrates River to lower the water levels beneath Babylon's gates. Meanwhile, discontent festered within the city. Belshazzar's rule was already unstable. His decision to feast while Cyrus's forces encircled the city suggests either shocking arrogance or a desperate bid to rally morale. Some accounts claim the Persians had help from traitors inside the walls, possibly priests of Marduk alienated by Belshazzar's policies. The miraculous fall of Babylon might have been a carefully orchestrated coup, with Cyrus exploiting existing fractures. The biblical narrative and Babylonian chronicles converge on one chilling detail. Belshazzar's death came not in battle, but in his own palace. Whether struck down by Persian soldiers or assassinated by conspirators, his end became a cautionary tale about the fragility of power. Cyrus, ever the shrewd politician, later positioned himself as Babylon's liberator, even claiming the god Marduk's favor. This duality, divine wrath and human ambition, would echo through history. Rulers learned that invoking heavenly mandate could justify earthly violence, while rebels understood that painting a king's death as punishment lent legitimacy to their cause. From Babylon's fallen dynasty to Rome's imperial intrigues, the intersection of faith and power proved deadly time and again. And nowhere was this fusion more volatile than in our next story, where a king's attempt to merge politics and religion would ignite a firestorm of rebellion, ending with a daggers thrust in the temple courtyard. Domitian's reign began with promise. A capable administrator who repaired Rome's fire, ravaged temples, and tightened the empire's finances. But by 96 CE, the emperor who once boasted of being addressed as Lord and God had become a paranoid recluse, his palace walls lined with polished stone so he could see reflections of anyone approaching from behind. The very fear he inflicted on others now consumed him, and for good reason. His purges had decimated the Senate, his spies lurked in every corner, and even his closest advisors tread carefully, knowing a single misstep could mean exile or execution. Yet none of his precautions could stop the conspiracy brewing under his nose, a plot led by the very people who dressed him each morning. The assassination was chilling in its intimacy. On September 18th, Domitian's chamberlain Parthenius and members of the imperial staff lured him into a private meeting, claiming they'd uncovered a plot. As the emperor examined a fake list of conspirators, a servant named Stephanus, who'd been feigning an arm injury for days, drew a dagger hidden in his bandages. The first strike wounded Domitian, but what followed was a frenzied struggle. The emperor fought back, grappling with his attackers as they stabbed him 7 more times. By the time the Praetorian Guard arrived, it was over. Rome's most feared ruler had been butchered by his own household staff, a humiliating end for a man who'd once declared himself invincible. Did his death bring peace? Initially, yes. The Senate erupted in celebration, tearing down his statues and erasing his name from monuments. His successor, Nerva, ushered in Rome's 5 good emperors era, promising to restore dignity and cooperation. But the cracks in the system remained. Nerva's reign nearly collapsed when the Praetorian Guard, angry over Domitian's murder, demanded his killers be punished. The new emperor had to appease them by sacrificing Parthenius and others, proof that even in death, Domitian's legacy of violence lingered. The assassination exposed a grim truth. No amount of paranoia could shield an emperor from the hatred he cultivated. Domitian's downfall wasn't just about politics, it was personal. The staff who dressed him, fed him, and guarded his chambers had turned against him, revealing that terror alone couldn't sustain power. In the end, the man who saw enemies everywhere failed to notice the ones who mattered. The silent hands that held his wine, adjusted his robes, and when the moment came, plunged in the knife. Rome's emperors slept behind locked doors, tasted every meal for poison, and surrounded themselves with bodyguards, yet the throne remained a death trap. Because the greatest threat never came from foreign armies or rebellious provinces. It waited in the shadows of the palace, in the smiles of trusted faces, in the quiet moments when rulers forgot one unshakable rule: to wield absolute power was to live on borrowed time. And as the next assassination proves, even the mightiest dynasties could crumble when the knives came out in the dead of night. Sparta in 241 BCE was a shadow of its former glory. Once the fearsome military powerhouse that defied Persia and humbled Athens, it now struggled with empty treasuries, shrinking armies, and a nobility clinging to outdated traditions. Into this stagnation stepped King Agis IV, a young ruler with a radical vision to restore Sparta's greatness by returning to the very laws that had built it. His plan: cancel debts, redistribute land to the poor, and expand citizenship to reinvigorate the warrior class. To Agis, these weren't just policies. They were a return to the Lycurgan way, the ancient code of equality and discipline that had made Sparta legendary. But the Spartan elite saw things differently. Wealthy landowners who had grown rich while the state decayed viewed Agis as a threat to their privilege. The young king's reforms would strip them of vast estates and erase the debts that kept poorer Spartans under their control. Even more dangerously, his ideas were gaining traction. When Agis persuaded his wealthy mother and grandmother to surrender their fortunes to the state, it sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. If even the king's family was willing to sacrifice for reform, how long before others demanded the same? The backlash was swift and brutal. While Agis was away leading Sparta's army, his co-king, Leonidas II, a man who had been exiled for opposing the reforms, returned with backing from the elite. Agis's supporters were arrested or fled, and the young king himself was tricked into seeking sanctuary at a temple, only to be dragged out and condemned in a sham trial. The sentence: execution by strangulation, a humiliating end for a man who had dreamed of reviving Sparta's soul. Was Agis's death a tragedy or a necessary check on reckless change? Supporters argued his reforms would have stabilized Sparta, preventing its eventual collapse. Critics claimed his idealism ignored reality. Redistributing land wouldn't magically restore Spartan discipline, and alienating the nobility risked civil war. Yet history's verdict leans toward the tragic. Within decades, Sparta's decline accelerated, its armies crushed, its influence faded. Another reformer, Cleomenes III, would try similar measures later, only to meet similar resistance. Agis's story reveals a cruel pattern. Those who challenge entrenched power often pay the highest price. From Rome's Gracchi brothers to Athens's democratic reformers, history is littered with idealists who dared to redistribute wealth or power and died for it. Their fates raise uncomfortable questions. Can a society reform itself peacefully when the privileged resist? Or does progress sometimes require bloodshed? The next assassination offers a grim answer, as another ruler learns that even the most well-intentioned changes can ignite a firestorm of vengeance. Commodus should have been a golden emperor, son of the revered Marcus Aurelius, heir to Rome's Pax Romana, groomed for leadership by Stoic philosophers. Instead, he became a spectacle. By 192 CE, the man who once ruled the world spent his days in the arena, slaughtering beasts and gladiators with rigged weapons while billing himself as the reincarnation of Hercules. Senators watched in horror as their emperor paraded in lion skins, demanded worship as a living god, and sold political offices to the highest bidder. The treasury drained to fund his games, the military grew restless, and whispers of revolt spread through the palace like smoke. Even his inner circle knew Rome couldn't survive much more of this. The conspiracy to remove Commodus was born not in the Senate's halls, but in his own household. His mistress Marcia, alerted to a purge list bearing her name, teamed up with the Chamberlain Eclectus and the Praetorian Prefect Letus. Their plan was chillingly simple: poison first, then strangle. On December 31st, as Commodus soaked in his bath after a gladiatorial bout, Marcia handed him a goblet of drugged wine. When the poison failed to kill him, they sent in Narcissus, the emperor's wrestling partner, to finish the job with bare hands. The man who had styled himself as Rome's strongest died gasping, his neck snapped by the very entertainer who had once sparred with him for applause. Did Rome breathe easier after his death? Initially, yes. The Senate declared Commodus a public enemy, erased his statues, and appointed the elderly Pertinax, a sensible general, as his successor. But stability proved fleeting. Within months, the Praetorian Guard murdered Pertinax too, auctioning the throne to a wealthy senator in one of history's most blatant power grabs. The year of the 5 emperors had begun, proving that removing a tyrant didn't guarantee peace, only a scramble for power. Commodus's reign exposes a paradox. The more detached a ruler became from reality, the more lethal their whims. His obsession with glory in the arena blinded him to the knives in the shadows. Where Marcus Aurelius wrote meditations on duty, his son staged mock battles with blunted swords. The lesson was clear: when leaders confused spectacle for governance, their downfall was only a matter of time. And as the next assassination shows, even the most disciplined rulers could fall prey to the vices they thought they'd mastered. The walls of Nineveh had never seemed so suffocating. King Sennacherib, the ruthless architect of Assyria's golden age, stood at the height of his power. His armies had razed Babylon. His siege engines humbled rebellious cities, and his palace shimmered with loot from 100 conquests. Yet on a quiet evening in 681 BCE, the mighty ruler met his end not on a battlefield, but in the very temple he'd built to honor the gods. The official court records are conspicuously vague, stating only that Sennacherib was struck down during prayers. But whispers from Babylon to Jerusalem told a darker tale, a conspiracy led by his own sons, who resented their father's favoritism toward a younger heir. The murder, if it was murder, reverberated across the empire. Sennacherib's eldest son, Ardamilisu, had been stripped of his inheritance just months earlier, a humiliation that left him simmering with rage. Ancient texts hint at a carefully staged ambush, with temple guards looking the other way as assassins closed in. Yet there's another layer to this mystery. Sennacherib's destruction of Babylon's sacred temples had earned him enemies among the priesthood, and some scholars argue the killing bore the hallmarks of a religious hit. The king's own inscriptions boasted of defying the gods. Could his death have been framed as divine retribution? The aftermath was telling. Sennacherib's chosen successor, Esarhaddon, swiftly crushed his brother's rebellion, but the damage was done. Assyria's aura of invincibility cracked, emboldening vassal states to test their chains. Though Esarhaddon would go on to rebuild Babylon and stabilize the empire, the seeds of decline had been sown. When rulers couldn't trust their own blood, how could they command the loyalty of distant provinces? This assassination exposes a brutal irony. The very dynasties built to preserve power often became its greatest threats. From Assyria's fratricidal princes to Rome's warring tetrarchs, family rivalries doomed more empires than any foreign invasion. And as the next story reveals, even the most carefully crafted succession plans could collapse when ambition wore the mask of kinship. Rome had seen eccentric emperors before, but none quite like Elagabalus. By 222 CE, the teenage ruler had turned the imperial palace into a spectacle of excess, painting his face with cosmetics, marrying a Vestal virgin in defiance of tradition, and forcing senators to watch him dance in sheer silk robes before his pet lions. His most scandalous act, though, was replacing Jupiter as Rome's chief deity with Elagabalus, a Syrian sun god whose worship involved orgiastic rituals and bizarre sacrifices. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, had tolerated much over the centuries, but this was a bridge too far. The assassination was as chaotic as Elagabalus's reign. When the emperor caught wind of a plot to replace him with his cousin Severus Alexander, he panicked, hiding in a chest stuffed with cushions and silks. The guards stormed the palace, dragging him along with his mother through the streets before butchering them both. Their bodies were mutilated, decapitated, and dumped in the Tiber River, a final humiliation for a ruler who treated Rome's traditions with contempt. The Senate wasted no time erasing his name from monuments, declaring him an enemy of the state posthumously. Was Elagabalus killed for his heresy or his incompetence? Ancient sources paint him as a decadent fool, but modern historians suspect darker forces at work. His attempts to centralize power around his Syrian priesthood alienated both the military and aristocracy. While his open flaunting of gender norms, he reportedly offered vast sums to any physician who could give him female anatomy, threatened Rome's rigid social order. Yet the speed with which Severus Alexander took power suggests this was less about morality and more about control. The guard didn't murder Elagabalus because he danced, they killed him because he'd become a liability. His death underscores a brutal pattern. Rulers who alienated every power base rarely died in their beds. From Caligula to Commodus, Rome's most reviled emperors shared one trait. They forgot that power, no matter how absolute, relied on the consent of the armed men who guarded their doors. Elagabalus's fate wasn't just punishment for eccentricity. It was a reminder that even emperors answered to someone. And as the next assassination proves, that someone often wore a uniform, King Pyrrhus of Epirus was a man who laughed in the face of danger, a warrior king whose very name became synonymous with costly victories. He'd fought Romans in Italy, Carthaginians in Sicily, and Macedonians in Greece, surviving countless battles with little more than scars and stories. Yet in 272 BCE, this battle-hardened conqueror met his end not on a glorious battlefield, but in the cramped streets of Argos, struck down by something as ordinary as a rooftop tile. The official account claims it was an accident. During a chaotic urban skirmish, an elderly woman, terrified by the fighting below, accidentally dislodged the clay tile that crushed Pyrrhus's skull. But history whispers another possibility, that the so-called accident was a carefully staged murder, orchestrated by enemies who knew they could never defeat him in open combat. Consider the timing. Pyrrhus had just been invited into Argos by a faction promising to betray the city to him, a suspiciously convenient offer. Once inside, he found himself trapped in narrow alleys, his forces scattered. Then came the tile, striking him with uncanny precision. Too convenient, some argued, for a man who'd made countless enemies. The Spartans despised him for ravaging their lands. The Macedonians resented his meddling in their succession wars. Even his own allies in Argos might have turned against him, fearing his ambitions would destabilize the region further. The aftermath only deepened the mystery. Pyrrhus's body was recovered by Antigonus, his longtime rival, who reportedly wept at the sight but not out of grief. This, he allegedly said, is what happens to those who can't be content with what they have. A telling remark hinting that Pyrrhus's relentless warmongering had finally caught up with him. The king who'd famously quipped, "One more victory like this and I am undone," after beating the Romans at Heraclea, had ironically been undone not by enemy swords, but by the quiet hands or perhaps deliberate negligence of those who'd had enough of his chaos. Was it murder? The truth may never be known, but Pyrrhus's death exposes a brutal reality of ancient power. Even the mightiest warriors couldn't armor themselves against betrayal in crowded streets or shadowed alleys. His fate became a cautionary tale about the limits of ambition, a reminder that no amount of battlefield glory could shield a leader from the quiet hatred of those who'd grown weary of war. And as the next assassination proves, that hatred often festered closest to home, Emperor Karakala's reign began with blood, his own brothers. In 211 CE, just days after their father Septimius Severus died, Karakala lured his co-emperor Geta into their mother's arms, where his soldiers stabbed the young man to death. The brutality didn't stop there. Karakala then ordered the execution of 20,000 of Geta's supporters, real or imagined, erasing his brother's name from monuments and even banning mourning. But cruelty, as Karakala would learn, has a way of circling back. 6 years later, on a dusty roadside near Carii, the emperor dismounted to relieve himself during a march to Mesopotamia. It was the last private moment he'd ever have. As he crouched, a soldier named Martialis drove a dagger into his back. The blade found its mark, and Rome's most hated ruler collapsed in the dirt, betrayed by the very men who'd sworn to protect him. Was this murder justice or mere opportunism? Karakala had spent his short reign alienating nearly everyone. He'd doubled soldiers' pay to buy their loyalty, bankrupting the treasury and forcing heavy taxes on the aristocracy. He'd masqueraded as a common legionary, sharing their hardships but also their resentments, and his paranoid purges had left even his inner circle glancing over their shoulders. The assassination plot, led by the Praetorian prefect Macrinus, wasn't some noble act of rebellion. It was a calculated power grab. Martialis, who held a personal grudge over a denied promotion, was merely the weapon. Within days, Macrinus declared himself emperor, proving that in Rome, loyalty was never to the man, only to the position. The irony was thick. Karakala, who'd idolized Alexander the Great and styled himself a warrior king, died not in battle but in humiliation, his body left exposed until a lowly cremation. His killers didn't even bother to damn his memory. The Senate, long cowed by his terror, simply sighed and moved on. Yet his death revealed a truth far more unsettling than one tyrant's downfall. Emperors ruled at the pleasure of their armies. From the Praetorian Guards' auctions of the throne to frontier legions declaring their own commanders emperor, military loyalty was the real currency of power. Karakala had bought his soldiers' affection with gold, but gold couldn't shield him from their knives when ambition stirred. And ambition, as the next assassination proves, burned brightest in those who'd been underestimated. Far from Rome's legions, in the sun-baked courts of Palmyra, a queen would rise only to discover that in the game of empires, no victory came without betrayal. King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia never stood a chance. By 74 BCE, his small but wealthy kingdom on the Black Sea coast had become little more than a chess piece in Rome's relentless expansion. For years, Nicomedes had walked a precarious tightrope, publicly deferring to Rome while secretly resenting its grip on his throne. Then, suddenly, the aging king was dead under suspicious circumstances, his will conveniently naming the Roman Republic as his heir. To many in the region, this wasn't just a transfer of power, it was a blatant land grab disguised as inheritance, and one man saw through the charade immediately. Mithridates VI of Pontus, Nicomedes' longtime rival and Rome's most formidable enemy in the east. The timing of Nicomedes' death was too perfect to ignore. Rome had long coveted Bithynia's strategic ports and lucrative trade routes, but outright conquest would have sparked outrage among neighboring kingdoms. A peaceful succession, however, gave them plausible deniability. Ancient sources like Appian and Cassius Dio hint at darker possibilities. Was Nicomedes poisoned by Roman agents, or pressured into signing his kingdom away under threat? Whatever the truth, the consequences were immediate. Mithridates, who had spent decades building an anti-Roman alliance, saw the annexation as the final straw. If Rome could swallow Bithynia without a fight, his own kingdom of Pontus would be next. Within months, his armies surged westward, igniting the Third Mithridatic War, a conflict that would drag Rome into its bloodiest eastern campaign yet. Nicomedes' story exposes a brutal reality of ancient geopolitics. Small kingdoms rarely controlled their own destinies, whether through marriage alliances, friendly occupations, or suspicious inheritances. Great powers like Rome absorbed weaker states with chilling efficiency. Bithynia wasn't unique. Armenia, Judea, and Numidia all met similar fates. Their rulers toppled or manipulated until their lands became provinces in all but name. What made Nicomed's case so explosive was the spark it lit in Mithridates, a leader shrewd enough to recognize Rome's tactics and bold enough to fight back. The tragedy of Nicomedes lies in his helplessness. However he died, whether by natural causes or Roman design, his passing became a pretext for war precisely because he ruled a buffer state between empires. His kingdom's wealth and location made it a target, his death an opportunity. And as the Mithridatic Wars raged on, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, one truth became undeniable. When giants clashed, it was always the smaller nations that bled first. Yet even the mightiest empires weren't immune to the chaos they sowed. As Rome grappled with Mithridates in the east, another assassination would soon shake its very heart, a murder so brazen it would expose the fragility of power even in the Republic's inner circle. Pertinax was supposed to be the reset Rome desperately needed. At 70 years old, he was a seasoned general, a former governor, and a man known for discipline, exactly the antidote to Commodus's decadence. When the Praetorian Guard handed him the throne after Commodus's murder, they likely expected business as usual: bribes, privileges, and lax oversight. Instead, they got austerity. Pertinax slashed extravagant spending, recovered stolen state funds, and even refused to pay the Guard's customary donative, the bonus every new emperor gave to secure their loyalty. To the Senate, these were long overdue reforms. To the Praetorians, they were an unforgivable betrayal. The assassination unfolded with chilling efficiency. Just 86 days into his reign, a contingent of guardsmen stormed the palace. Pertinax, ever the soldier, didn't flee. He strode forward, attempting to reason with them, a fatal miscalculation. One blade silenced him mid-sentence. The man who'd survived Germanic winters and Parthian arrows died on his own marble floors, his blood pooling around the very sandals of the men sworn to protect him. What followed was a spectacle that laid bare Rome's rot. The Praetorian Guard, now unchecked, took the unprecedented step of auctioning the throne to the highest bidder. Senators and wealthy elites gathered outside their camp as bids were shouted like prices at a slave market. Didius Julius, a decadent senator with deep pockets and shallow scruples, won with a promise of 25,000 sesterces per guardsman, roughly 5 years' salary. Rome awoke to the surreal sight of their new emperor parading through the streets, flanked by the men who'd just murdered his predecessor. Was Pertinax's death inevitable? His reforms certainly painted a target on his back, but the deeper issue was systemic. The Guard had grown accustomed to being kingmakers, and Pertinax's refusal to play along shattered their expectations. His mistake wasn't tightening the purse strings. It was underestimating how thoroughly corruption had rooted itself in Rome's power structure. The Praetorians didn't just want a generous emperor, they demanded one. And when denied, they proved that loyalty, in the end, was just another commodity. This wasn't merely a coup, it was a watershed moment. The auction exposed the empire's fragile facade. Legions in the provinces, hearing of the farce in Rome, began declaring their own generals emperor. Within months, 3 rival claimants would plunge the empire into civil war, proving that once greed eclipsed duty, even the mightiest institutions crumbled. And as the next assassination shows, no amount of gold could armor a throne when the men holding it saw power as something to be sold, not served. King Antiochus III had once been called the Great, a title earned through decades of military campaigns that stretched his Seleucid empire from modern-day Turkey to the borders of India. By 187 BCE, however, the aging ruler was a shadow of his former self, his empire fraying at the edges, his rivals circling. Then, suddenly, he was dead, not on a battlefield, not in his sleep, but in a temple in Elymais where he'd gone to plunder its legendary treasures. The official cause, poison, the whispers, betrayal. The timing was suspicious. Antiochus had spent years trying to rebuild his empire after a crushing defeat by Rome at the Battle of Magnesia. Desperate for funds to pay Rome's crippling war indemnities, he'd turned to looting temples, a sacrilege that alienated priests and commoners alike. When he demanded the gold of Elymais' temple of Bel, the locals resisted. Some accounts claim they poisoned his wine. Others suggest a disgruntled courtier slipped him a fatal dose during the chaos. Either way, his death wasn't just an assassination, it was a reckoning. The king who'd spent his life conquering foreign lands fell to the quiet vengeance of those he'd pushed too far. The aftermath was chaos. Antiochus' son, Seleucus IV, inherited an empire drowning in debt and dissent. Without his father's military genius to hold it together, the Seleucid realm began to splinter. Client states rebelled, governors declared independence, and Rome, ever watchful, tightened its grip on the weakened kingdom. Antiochus' death didn't just remove a ruler, it accelerated the unraveling of one of the ancient world's last great Hellenistic powers. Poison was the perfect weapon for an era where power shifted in shadows. Unlike the public spectacle of a dagger strike, poison allowed killers to distance themselves, to let time obscure their guilt. A ruler might collapse days or weeks after the deed, his symptoms chalked up to illness. Suspicion would swirl, but evidence rarely. From Rome's Claudius to India's Chandragupta Maurya, history is littered with rulers who dined with enemies and never rose from the table. Antiochus' fate underscores a chilling truth. In politics, the deadliest threats often came disguised as hospitality. A shared cup of wine, a feast among allies. These were the moments when power was most vulnerable. And as the next assassination proves, even the most cautious rulers couldn't outrun a toxin slipped into their chalice by smiling hands. Julia Domna, mother to both Emperor Karakala and his younger brother Geta, had once dreamed her sons would rule Rome together in harmony, a vision as naive as it was short-lived. By 211 CE, the imperial palace had become a house divided. The brothers, who had shared everything from tutors to military campaigns as boys, now moved through the same halls with separate armed escorts, each man's food tasted for poison, each whisper treated as a potential death warrant. The final act of their tragedy unfolded in their mother's private chambers, where Domna had begged them to reconcile. Geta, just 22 years old, clung to her, believing her presence would shield him. He was wrong. Karakala's betrayal was as calculated as it was brutal. Feigning a desire for peace, he arrived with centurions disguised as palace staff. When Geta rushed into their mother's arms at the sight of armed men, the soldiers struck. Julia Domna, caught in the horror, watched as her younger son bled out on her robes, his last breaths choked with pleas she couldn't answer. The butchery didn't end there. Karakala ordered the execution of 20,000 suspected Geta loyalists, real or imagined, and erased his brother's image from every coin, statue, and scroll in the empire. Even mourning was forbidden. Citizens caught grieving risked death. This wasn't merely fratricide, it was a chilling lesson in the logic of dynastic survival. In Rome's cutthroat political climate, shared power was an illusion. Sibling rivalry had felled kings from Macedonia to Ptolemaic Egypt, but Karakala's act stood out for its stark pragmatism. By eliminating Geta, he didn't just remove a co-ruler, he preempted any future revolt. The message was clear: in the pursuit of absolute authority, blood ties meant nothing. Yet the irony cut deeper. Karakala's paranoia, born of his own crime, would haunt him. 6 years later, he too would die at the hands of those he trusted, a Praetorian Guard officer driving a dagger into his back during a roadside stop. Violence, once unleashed, rarely stopped with a single victim. The fate of Geta and Karakala exposes a timeless truth. Power doesn't just corrupt, it isolates. Rulers who saw threats in every shadow eventually made enemies of their own flesh and blood. And as the next assassination reveals, even the most lavish palaces couldn't shield emperors from the consequences of their own ruthlessness. King Ptolemy XI of Egypt barely had time to warm the throne before it, and he went up in flames. Crowned in 80 BCE under Rome's heavy-handed influence, he was given just 19 days to prove himself before the people of Alexandria decided they'd seen enough. The breaking point came when he ordered the murder of his popular stepmother and co-ruler, Berenice III, a woman beloved by the masses for her diplomatic grace. The streets erupted. What began as murmurs of discontent swelled into a roaring mob that stormed the palace, dragging the young king into the public gymnasium. There, surrounded by the very citizens he'd ruled over, Ptolemy met a fate few monarchs ever faced: death by collective fury. Was this justice or mere chaos? The answer depends on who you asked. To Rome, which had installed Ptolemy as a puppet, the lynching was an unacceptable defiance of their authority. To the Alexandrians, it was long overdue retribution for a dynasty that had grown detached and cruel. The Ptolemies, descendants of Alexander the Great's general, had once been seen as divine protectors of Egypt, but by Ptolemy XI's reign, they were viewed as foreign oppressors, more concerned with appeasing Rome than feeding their own people. His murder wasn't just about one act of violence. It was the explosion of decades of bottled rage against a ruling class that had forgotten its duty. The aftermath revealed the paradox of mob rule. Without Ptolemy, Alexandria descended into factional strife, with no clear successor and Rome looming hungrily over the chaos. The people had taken power back, but only for a moment. Soon, another Ptolemy would be crowned, and the cycle would repeat. Yet this bloody interlude sent a message that echoed across the ancient world. Rulers who ignored their subjects did so at their peril. From the grain markets of Egypt to the forums of Rome, the lesson was clear. A throne might be won by armies or inherited by blood, but it could be lost in a single afternoon to the voices of those who'd been silenced too long. And those voices, once awakened, rarely fell quiet again. As Rome's own republic would soon discover, the line between righteous uprising and ruthless anarchy was thinner than a papyrus scroll. When the people decided justice belonged in their hands, even the mightiest empires had reason to tremble. Alexander Severus should have been the perfect emperor, young, handsome, and raised by his formidable mother Julia Mamaea to value stability, diplomacy, and compromise. He inherited the throne at just 13 years old, his reign beginning with promise under her careful guidance. For a time, it worked. He negotiated peace with Persia, reformed taxes to ease the burden on citizens, and even tried to appease the army with bonuses, a balancing act that kept Rome intact during turbulent years. But by 235 CE, the very soldiers he'd worked so hard to please turned on him in a grisly mutiny near Mainz. The boy emperor who dodged assassination attempts and civil wars met his end not in the Senate or the palace, but in a muddy army tent, slaughtered alongside his mother by the men who'd sworn oaths to protect them. What went wrong? The answer lies in the impossible expectations of Rome's military machine. Severus had tried to be both a diplomat and a warrior emperor, but the legions wanted a commander who led from the front, who showered them with gold and glory. His cautious approach, negotiating rather than crushing Germanic tribes, was seen as weakness. When he attempted to buy off invading Alemanni tribes instead of fighting, the soldiers' patience snapped. Their discontent found a leader in Maximinus Thrax, a hulking former shepherd whose brute strength and battlefield prowess embodied everything Severus wasn't. The contrast was fatal. To the legions, Severus's restraint wasn't wisdom, it was cowardice, and in their eyes, Rome deserved a ruler who seized power, not one who begged for peace. The assassination wasn't just a change of leadership, it was a seismic shift in Roman politics. Severus's death marked the start of the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year nightmare of civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse. Emperors would now rise and fall at the whim of provincial armies, their reigns measured in months rather than years. The Praetorian Guard's backroom plots paled in comparison to the raw power of legions declaring their own generals emperor. Severus had been the last ruler to cling to the old illusion of imperial legitimacy. After him, the throne belonged to whoever could hold it by sheer force. Yet there's a tragic irony in his downfall. Severus wasn't a tyrant or a fool. He was a decent leader in an era that no longer rewarded decency. His reforms had stabilized the economy, his diplomacy had spared countless lives, and his respect for the Senate had maintained a fragile veneer of tradition. But in the end, none of that mattered. The empire had grown too large, its armies too restless, its institutions too brittle. A ruler who sought consensus in a world that only understood the sword was doomed from the start. Alexander Severus's death wasn't just the fall of an emperor, it was the unraveling of an empire. And as Rome spiraled into chaos, the next assassination would prove that even the strongest warlords weren't safe from the knives of their own men. King Mithridates VI of Pontus had spent his life outsmarting Rome, poisoning his enemies, stockpiling antidotes, and surviving assassination attempts that would have killed lesser men. But by 63 BCE, the once mighty ruler found himself cornered in his coastal fortress, abandoned by allies, and staring down the legions of Pompey the Great. The man who had defied Rome for decades now faced an impossible choice: surrender and be paraded through the streets in chains, or take control of his fate one final time. Ancient historians like Appian and Cassius Dio tell us Mithridates chose the latter, gathering his daughters and closest companions. He distributed vials of poison, urging them to die free rather than live as Roman trophies. As his daughters drank first, the old king swallowed his dose, only to discover his years of building immunity to toxins had rendered the poison useless. In the end, a loyal bodyguard had to run him through with a sword, granting the death he'd sought. But was this heroic suicide or a carefully staged murder? Pompey had every reason to prefer Mithridates dead. A public trial in Rome would have been a spectacle, risking sympathy for the aging king, who'd once rallied Greece and Asia Minor against Roman oppression. Worse, Pompey's rival Crassus might have used the event to undermine his victory. The circumstances are suspicious. Mithridates' sudden loss of allies, the lack of a witnessed death scene, and Pompey's swift claim that the king had chosen the honorable path. Even the body presented to Pompey was reportedly unrecognizable, a charred corpse in royal robes, conveniently unable to contradict the official story. Mithridates' death reveals a brutal truth about ancient power struggles. Dead rivals were far more useful than live ones. From Carthage's Hannibal to Egypt's Cleopatra, Rome's greatest enemies rarely survived capture. A living prisoner could escape, inspire rebellion, or become a pawn for political rivals, but a corpse could be displayed as a warning, its narrative shaped by the victors. Pompey didn't just defeat Mithridates, he erased him, transforming the complex, brilliant ruler into a simple cautionary tale. this pattern wasn't unique to Rome. In Persia, rebel leaders were crucified along roadways as silent reminders of imperial might. Macedonian generals poisoned their prisoners to prevent rescue attempts. Even among allies, the safest rival was often a dead one because history, as the next assassination proves, is written not by those who fought fairly, but by those who survived to tell the tale. Emperor Gallienus had ruled Rome for 15 turbulent years, a marathon by the standards of the crisis of the 3rd century, when most emperors barely survived months. A philosopher king who wrote poetry and debated Plato, he'd somehow held the fracturing empire together through invasions, plagues, and no fewer than 18 revolts by rival claimants. Yet in 268 CE, as he besieged the rebel general Aureolus in Milan, his own officers decided enough was enough. The conspiracy was hatched not in some shadowed alley, but around a campfire where generals who'd fought side by side with Gallienus for years now whispered about his weakness. Their grievance, he'd begun favoring common soldiers over the aristocratic officer class, promoting talent over birthright. To men who believed leadership was their birthright, this was unforgivable. The assassination was swift and intimate. As Gallienus rushed to respond to a reported attack on the camp's perimeter, a ruse, his cavalry commander Aurelian and the Praetorian prefect Heraclianus led him straight into an ambush. A spear thrust pierced his side, leaving him crumpled in the dirt. His last words, according to one account, were a bitter question: "Who have I failed?" The answer in his killer's eyes was simple. He'd failed to uphold the old order where patricians ruled and plebeians obeyed, yet history paints a different picture. Gallienus had been ahead of his time, recognizing that Rome's survival depended on merit, not pedigree. His reforms, like creating a mobile cavalry force to respond to crises, would later save the empire. Did his death bring stability? In the short term, yes. The conspirators installed Claudius Gothicus, a respected general who crushed the Goths and briefly slowed Rome's unraveling. But the precedent set was catastrophic, by proving even a competent emperor could be murdered for displeasing the elite. Gallienus's assassination deepened the military anarchy. Within months, Claudius himself would die of plague, and the cycle of violence resumed. The tragedy of Gallienus lies in its irony. The very reforms meant to strengthen Rome, professionalizing the army, decentralizing power, made him enemies among those clinging to privilege. His death wasn't just the fall of a ruler. It was a victory for short-sightedness over innovation. And as the next conspiracy would prove, no amount of battlefield glory could shield an emperor from the knives of men who valued tradition over survival. King Jugurtha of Numidia had spent years outmaneuvering Rome, bribing senators, playing rivals against each other, and surviving battles that should have killed him. By 104 BCE, however, his luck ran out. Captured not in combat but through treachery, betrayed by his own father-in-law, King Bocchus of Mauritania, the once defiant ruler, found himself paraded through Rome in chains, his fate sealed not by the sword, but by the suffocating darkness of the Tullianum, the city's most notorious dungeon. The execution was as calculated as it was cruel. Stripped of his royal robes and left to starve in the underground pit, Jugurtha's final moments were a far cry from the battlefield glory he'd once known. Some accounts claim his captors taunted him as he shivered in the cold, whispering, "Sleep well, king." The irony was bitter. This was the same man who'd once scoffed at Rome's corruption, declaring the city for sale to anyone with gold. Now his gold meant nothing. His defiance meant nothing. In the end, Rome didn't just defeat Jugurtha, they humiliated him, turning his death into a spectacle to warn other would-be challengers. But was this justice or hypocrisy? Jugurtha's crimes were real. He'd murdered his cousins to seize Numidia's throne and bribed Roman officials to ignore his aggression. Yet Rome's hands weren't clean. The senators who condemned him had taken his bribes gladly until his wars disrupted their profits. His execution wasn't about morality, it was about control. By dragging a foreign king into their dungeon, Rome sent a message. Resistance would be crushed, but betrayal would be rewarded. Bocchus, the very man who handed Jugurtha over, was gifted land and titles, proving that loyalty to Rome paid better than defiance. Jugurtha's fate became a blueprint for how empires dealt with troublesome rulers. From Carthage Hasdrubal to Armenia's Tigranes, foreign leaders who defied Rome often met similar ends: captured, displayed, and erased. Yet there's a darker lesson here. Empires didn't just conquer lands, they corrupted them, turning allies into informants and kings into prisoners. Jugurtha's story wasn't just about one man's fall. It was about the slow, suffocating grip of imperial power, where even the strongest rulers could be broken if they refused to kneel. And as the next assassination reveals, that grip tightened not just around foreign enemies, but around Rome's own elite. In the marble halls of the Senate, where daggers hid beneath togas, even the most powerful men weren't safe from the knives of ambition. Emperor Aurelian had done the impossible. He'd pulled Rome back from the brink. In just 5 short years, he'd crushed rebel empires in Gaul and Palmyra, fortified the city with massive walls that still stand today, and restored stability to an empire that had been tearing itself apart for decades. By 275 CE, Rome finally had a ruler worthy of the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, he was struck down not by barbarians or rival claimants, but by his own terrified officers over a paperwork error. The tragedy unfolded on a dusty road near Byzantium. Aurelian's secretary, a man named Eros, had been caught in a lie, likely embezzling funds or forging documents. Facing the emperor's infamous temper, Eros panicked. Knowing Aurelian's reputation for swift justice, he crafted a desperate scheme, forging a death list with the names of high-ranking officers, then leaking it to them. The ruse worked too well. Convinced Aurelian planned to purge them, a group of Praetorian officers ambushed him during a routine inspection. The emperor, caught off guard, had no time to defend himself. His last words, reportedly, were stunned. "Does this seem just to you?" Did his assassins realize their mistake? Ancient sources like Zosimus suggest some officers later regretted their haste, but the damage was done. Aurelian's death wasn't just the loss of a great leader. It was a catastrophic blow to Rome's fragile recovery. His reforms had been working. The economy stabilized, the borders hardened, the legions reunified. Yet in an empire where trust had eroded to dust, even the most loyal men could be manipulated into believing the worst. The aftermath was as predictable as it was devastating. Without Aurelian's iron grip, Rome spiraled back into chaos. The Senate, desperate to avoid another military coup, handed power to an elderly senator named Tacitus, a man who lasted just 6 months before being murdered by his own troops. Over the next decade, emperors would rise and fall at the speed of rumor, each weaker than the last. Aurelian's death proved a grim lesson. In times of crisis, fear could undo even the mightiest ruler's achievements. What makes this assassination so haunting isn't the violence, it's the absurdity. Rome's savior fell not to treason or ambition, but to bureaucratic panic. A forged list, a whispered lie, and the empire's best hope was gone. It's a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, is always fragile in the hands of those who believe they have nothing left to lose. And as the next story reveals, that fragility only deepened with time. In the twilight of Rome's dominance, even the most celebrated generals would discover that victory on the battlefield meant little when daggers waited at home. King Perseus of Macedon never stood a chance against Rome's iron grip. By 166 BCE, his once proud kingdom, the land of Alexander the Great, had been reduced to a pawn in Rome's relentless expansion. After his crushing defeat at the Battle of Pydna, Perseus fled north, hoping to regroup or escape. But Rome's reach was long and its vengeance longer. Cornered on the island of Samothrace, the last king of Macedon surrendered, not to the glory of battle, but to the humiliating grip of Roman chains. What followed wasn't just captivity, it was erasure. Perseus was paraded through Rome in Lucius Aemilius Paulus's triumph, a living trophy displayed alongside looted treasures and conquered banners. The Senate, eager to make an example of him, spared his life briefly. Exiled to the dreary town of Alba Fusens, he wasted away in obscurity, his name scrubbed from Macedonian records, his lineage severed. Some historians argue he died of neglect, others whisper of a quiet execution. Either way, Rome ensured his story ended not with defiance but with silence. Did his downfall truly mark the end of Greek independence? The answer is both yes and no. Macedon's dissolution shattered the last major Hellenistic power capable of resisting Rome, but Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta technically retained self-rule, albeit as client states, their freedoms hollowed out by Roman oversight. The real turning point came in 146 BCE, when Corinth was razed and the Achaean League crushed. Yet Perseus's fate was the warning shot. Resistance meant annihilation, while submission meant slow suffocation. Rome's treatment of Macedon set a chilling precedent. The kingdom was carved into 4 puppet republics, forbidden from trading or intermarrying, a deliberate strategy to fracture its identity. Over time, even these remnants were absorbed into a Roman province. This wasn't mere conquest, it was systemic dismantling. From Macedon to Carthage, Rome didn't just defeat its rivals, it dissolved them, replacing kings with governors and sovereignty with taxes. Perseus's tragedy lies in its inevitability. He wasn't a tyrant or a fool, just the last man standing when the tide of history turned. His capture wasn't an ending, but a blueprint. Empires, after all, don't just conquer land. They rewrite the rules, leaving smaller kingdoms to choose between rebellion and irrelevance. And as Rome's shadow stretched eastward, another dynasty would soon learn that survival often meant surrendering more than just a crown. Emperor Probus was the kind of ruler Rome desperately needed. A battle-hardened general who'd spent years driving back barbarian hordes, restoring neglected farmlands, and even planting vineyards along the Danube to boost the empire's food supply. By 282 CE, he'd earned a reputation as a man who valued discipline and productivity, traits that had pulled Rome from the brink of collapse. Yet that same no-nonsense attitude would be his undoing in the most absurd way imaginable, a quarrel over gardening duties. The scene was almost comical in its pettiness. Probus, ever the pragmatist, had ordered his soldiers to help drain swamps and tend vineyards during peacetime, a reasonable demand, given that idle troops were a recipe for mutiny. But to the legionaries, this was an insult. They'd signed up to fight, not to play farmer. Resentment festered until one day, as Probus inspected their work near Sirmium, a group of soldiers turned on him. The dispute escalated into a shouting match, then a brawl, and finally, a deadly ambush. The emperor, who'd survived countless battles, fell to the blades of his own men, not in a glorious revolt, but over what amounted to a labor dispute. Was this really about vineyards? Unlikely. Probus's reforms had alienated more than just grumbling foot soldiers. By cutting back on donatives, the traditional bonuses troops expected, and enforcing strict discipline, he'd stepped on the toes of officers who profited from loose oversight. The vineyard incident may have been the spark, but the tinder had been piling up for years. Rome's military culture had grown entitled, accustomed to bribes and lax discipline. Probus's vision of a self-sufficient, hard-working empire clashed with their expectations, and in the end, the legions preferred a weaker emperor to a stricter one. The irony was crushing. Probus had spent his reign fixing the very problems that killed him. His agricultural projects were meant to stabilize the economy. His discipline was designed to curb the corruption that had fueled decades of civil war. Yet in trying to save Rome from itself, he'd underestimated how deeply rot had set into its foundations. Soldiers who'd once fought for gold now refused to lift a finger without it. His death wasn't just another imperial assassination. It was a symptom of Rome's deeper sickness. The empire had become a machine that devoured its best rulers and rewarded its worst. Probus's successor, Carus, would last barely a year before being struck by lightning, or so the official story claimed, and the cycle of short-lived emperors would continue. The lesson was clear. In a world where power relied on the whims of armed men, even the pettiest slight could be lethal. And as the next assassination would prove, those men weren't just picky about their chores, they were ruthless about their pride. King Cleomenes III of Sparta had dared to dream of revival, to rekindle the flame of Lycurgus's ancient laws in a city that had long since abandoned them. By 219 BCE, his bold reforms had redistributed land, cancelled crushing debts, and expanded citizenship to rebuild Sparta's withered warrior class. But to the wealthy elites who had grown fat on inequality, Cleomenes wasn't a reformer, he was a threat. And threats in Sparta's waning days were met not with debate but with blood. His downfall came at the hands of Antigonus, the Macedonian king who saw Sparta's resurgence as a danger to his own dominance. After a crushing defeat at the Battle of Sellasia, Cleomenes fled to Egypt, hoping to rally support from Ptolemy IV. Instead, he walked into a gilded trap. Ptolemy, ever the opportunist, imprisoned him not out of malice but out of cold calculation. A weakened Sparta was more useful to Egypt than a revitalized one. When Cleomenes staged a desperate escape attempt, Ptolemy's response was swift. Cornered and outnumbered, the Spartan king chose the only exit left to him, ordering his loyal companions to kill him before the guards could drag him back to his cell. Was his death a tragedy or inevitability? The answer depends on who you ask. To his supporters, Cleomenes was the last true Spartan, a man who tried to restore the discipline and equality that had once made his city unconquerable. His reforms mirrored those of Agis IV decades earlier, and like Agis, he paid for his vision with his life. But to his enemies, he was a destabilizing force, a reckless idealist who ignored the reality that Sparta's glory days were long past. The old powers Macedon, Egypt, Rome had no interest in a resurgent Sparta, and they had the armies to enforce their indifference. The fate of Cleomenes reveals a brutal pattern. Revolutionaries who challenged the established order rarely died old. From Rome's Gracchi brothers to Athens's democratic firebrands, history is littered with reformers who dared to redistribute wealth or power, only to be crushed by those who benefited from the status quo. Even when their ideas were just, their timing was fatal. Sparta in Cleomenes' era was a shadow of its former self, its population dwindling, its influence faded. No amount of land reform could reverse centuries of decline. Yet there's a haunting question lingering over his story. What if he'd succeeded? If Sparta had regained even a fraction of its former strength, might it have slowed Rome's relentless march, or would the outcome have been the same, just delayed? Cleomenes' death wasn't just the end of a man. It was the extinguishing of an alternative path, one where ancient virtues might have briefly flickered back to life. Instead, Sparta became another cautionary tale, a reminder that in the game of empires, idealism was often the first casualty. And as the next assassination proves, even the most pragmatic rulers weren't safe when their ambitions outran their allies. In the sun-baked courts of the East, another king would learn that no amount of cunning could shield him from the knives of those he'd crossed. Emperor Numerian's reign ended not with a battle cry or a dramatic conspiracy, but with a sickly stench wafting from his closed litter as his army marched home from Persia in 284 CE. For days, his attendants claimed the young emperor was resting, shielding his eyes from the sunlight due to a sudden illness. But when the smell grew unbearable, soldiers finally tore open the curtains, only to find Numerian's corpse rotting inside, his death concealed for nearly a week. The official explanation, a tragic eye infection that spread fatally, yet the timing was suspicious. Numerian's father-in-law, the ambitious Praetorian prefect Aper, had been the one insisting the emperor remain unseen. And when the troops demanded answers, Aper's evasiveness turned suspicion into outright accusation. The truth may never be unearthed, but the aftermath was telling. Diocletian, commander of the imperial bodyguard, didn't waste time debating the cause of death. Before the army could splinter into factions, he stood before the troops and declared Aper a traitor, then drew his sword and killed the prefect on the spot, a dramatic gesture that earned him the loyalty of the legions and shortly after the throne. Was this justice or a calculated power grab? Diocletian's swift rise hints at a darker possibility, that Numerian's death, whether natural or not, was less a tragedy than an opportunity. This shadowy end wasn't unique. Ancient history is littered with rulers whose deaths were obscured by design. From Alexander the Great's sudden fever, rumored to be poison, to King Herod's agonizing demise, attributed to everything from divine punishment to his doctor's sabotage, uncertainty was a weapon. For every public assassination, there were a dozen deaths like Numerian's, where the line between illness and murder blurred. Courts thrived on ambiguity. A convenient plague could disguise a poisoning. A fall from a horse might cover up a pushed stumble. In an era without autopsies or forensic scrutiny, narratives were shaped by those left standing. Numerian's fate underscores a chilling reality. In politics, sometimes the most dangerous lies weren't about who killed the king, but whether he'd been killed at all. Control the story, and you controlled the aftermath. Diocletian's immediate purge of Aper ensured no one would ask inconvenient questions. The lesson was clear. In the game of power, doubt could be as lethal as a dagger. And as the next assassination reveals, those who mastered ambiguity often held the sharpest blades. King Demetrius I of Macedon had spent his life mastering the art of war-crushing rebellions, outmaneuvering rivals, and expanding his kingdom's borders with a mix of strategy and sheer audacity. Yet by 150 BCE, the battlefield prowess that had won him the throne became irrelevant in the face of a far more insidious threat, the simmering resentment of his own people. The man who'd once been hailed as a liberator now found himself barricaded in his palace, surrounded by subjects who saw him not as a hero, but as a tyrant. His final moments were as brutal as they were symbolic, dragged from his hiding place in a temple, beaten by the mob, and left to die in the very streets he'd once ruled. What turned the tide against him? Demetrius's downfall wasn't the result of a single misstep, but a slow erosion of loyalty. His early reign had been marked by bold victories, but his obsession with military campaigns drained Macedonia's treasury and manpower. Farmers were conscripted, taxes soared, and the kingdom's once proud cities decayed under neglect. Worse, his abrasive personality alienated the nobility. Where his predecessors had balanced strength with diplomacy, Demetrius ruled with contempt, openly mocking advisors and dismissing complaints as weakness. The final straw came when he returned from a disastrous campaign against Rome's allies, not with glory, but with demands for more troops and gold. The people had reached their limit. The assassination itself was less a planned coup than an explosion of pent-up fury. When Demetrius attempted to flee his palace disguised as a beggar, his own subjects recognized him, not by his face, but by the lavish purple cloak he'd foolishly kept hidden beneath his rags. The irony was cruel. The trappings of kingship, the very symbols he'd clung to, betrayed him in the end. As the mob closed in, his bodyguards abandoned him, leaving the once mighty king to face the justice of the crowd. Was this murder or retribution? The answer depends on who you ask. To Rome and Macedon's elite, Demetrius was a failed ruler whose recklessness had endangered the kingdom. His death paved the way for a more pliable successor, one who wouldn't provoke Rome's wrath, but to the common people who'd suffered under his rule, this was long overdue accountability. Demetrius hadn't just lost battles, he'd broken the unspoken covenant between ruler and ruled, where protection and stability were exchanged for loyalty. When he could no longer provide either, the contract dissolved. The tragedy of Demetrius lies in its universality. From Babylon to Byzantium, kingship was a fragile illusion, sustained only as long as the people consented to believe in it. A ruler might command armies, wear crowns, and claim divine favor, but none of that mattered if the butcher, the baker, and the farmer decided he'd outlived his usefulness. Demetrius's fate became a grim lesson. Power wasn't just taken, it was lent, and those who forgot the terms of the loan often paid with their lives. And as the final assassination in our series would prove, even the most cunning rulers couldn't escape the consequences of their own ambition. In the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, a queen would rise to unprecedented heights only to discover that in the Game of Thrones, the highest stakes were always paid in blood. Emperor Maximinus Thrax was a giant of a man both in stature and in brutality. Standing over 8 feet tall according to ancient sources, this former shepherd had risen through the ranks on sheer physical prowess, crushing Rome's enemies with a ferocity that impressed the legions but terrified everyone else. By 238 CE, his reign had become a masterclass in tyranny. Taxes soared to fund endless wars, senators were executed on suspicion alone, and provincial governors lived in fear of his wrath. Yet the very violence that secured his throne would ultimately destroy it, in a mutiny as chaotic as his rule had been ruthless. The end came not on some distant battlefield, but in the unlikeliest of places, a siege camp outside Aquileia, where Maximinus's own troops finally snapped. For months they'd endured grueling marches, dwindling supplies, and their emperor's volcanic temper. When the city's defiant resistance stretched into summer, frustration boiled over. The tipping point, a rumor, perhaps spread by disgruntled officers, that Maximinus planned to decimate the army for its failures. Whether true or not, the damage was done. On a sweltering morning, soldiers stormed his tent, dragging him and his son from their beds. The emperor, who'd once boasted of crushing skulls with his bare hands, met his end with a legionary sword to the throat, his body left to rot alongside his heirs in the dirt. Did Rome breathe easier after his fall? Not for long. Maximinus's death kicked off the infamous year of the Six Emperors, a whirlwind of coups and counter-coups that left the empire reeling. The Senate, desperate for stability, declared 2 elderly senators co-emperors only for both to be murdered within months. The Praetorian Guard, sensing weakness, imposed their own candidate. Provincial legions, emboldened by the chaos, proclaimed their generals emperor. Maximinus's downfall didn't end the bloodshed. It unleashed a free-for-all where ambition trumped loyalty, and every soldier with a grudge or a grievance saw a chance to seize power. The irony was inescapable. Maximinus had ruled through fear, believing terror was the glue that held empires together. Yet his demise proved the opposite. Cruelty bred resentment, and resentment bred mutiny. History's tyrants, from Caligula to Commodus, rarely died peacefully in their beds. Their reigns often ended as they'd begun, in blood, betrayal, and the shattered illusion that force alone could sustain power. Maximinus's story wasn't just about one man's brutality. It was a warning: rule by the sword, and you'll perish by it, leaving behind not order, but a vacuum where the next strongman would inevitably rise. And so our journey through these 30 assassinations closes with a chilling truth. The pursuit of power in the ancient world was a cycle as unbreakable as it was deadly. From the daggers of Rome's Senate to the poisoned cups of Persia's palaces, no throne was truly safe, and no ruler, no matter how mighty, could outrun the consequences of their own ambition. The lesson etched in blood across centuries was simple: those who live by violence will rarely die any other way. The blade that felled an emperor or the poison that silenced a king never acted alone. Each assassination sent ripples through history, toppling dynasties and redrawing the map of empires. When Julius Caesar collapsed at the feet of Pompey's statue, his murder didn't just end one man's life. It extinguished the last flicker of the Roman Republic, paving the way for imperial rule. Centuries later, the plotting of a few disgruntled officers in a Macedonian camp didn't merely kill Emperor Gallienus, it plunged Rome into 50 years of chaos known as the crisis of the 3rd century. These weren't isolated acts of violence, they were seismic shifts disguised as personal vendettas, where a single dagger thrust could alter the fate of millions. Yet for all their immediate impact, assassinations rarely achieved their intended goals long-term. The conspirators who killed Caesar dreamed of restoring senatorial power, only to hand absolute authority to his heir. The Praetorian Guard's murder of Pertinax didn't secure their privileges, it exposed their greed, triggering a civil war. Time and again, the cycle repeated. A ruler's death created a vacuum, inviting chaos rather than stability. Even successful coups, like the overthrow of Caligula, merely replaced one tyrant with another, proving that violence alone couldn't engineer lasting change. The ancient world operated on a brutal calculus: power taken by force had to be held by force, and every assassination planted the seeds of the next. Modern politics, though far removed from the blood-soaked halls of ancient courts, still echoes these age-old struggles. While leaders today rarely face literal daggers, the mechanisms of betrayal remain eerily familiar: backroom deals, character assassinations, and the quiet undermining of rivals. The difference lies in the stakes. Where ancient assassinations could trigger wars or collapse civilizations, modern power shifts unfold through elections or legal maneuvers. Yet the underlying tension persists: the balance between ambition and stability, between the hunger for control and the fear of overthrow. Could these brutal acts have been avoided? Perhaps, but only if power had been less concentrated, less tantalizing. In systems where authority rested on the whim of armies or the loyalty of a few elites, assassination became a twisted form of checks and balances. The true tragedy isn't that these murders happened, but that they were often the only way to remove tyrants or disrupt corruption. The deeper question lingers: in a world where power corrupts absolutely, is violence the inevitable price of change, or just the failure of imagination? As history whispers its warnings, one truth remains: the shadows of the past still stretch long over the present. Power in the ancient world was never just handed over, it was seized, defended, and often lost in rivers of blood. These 30 assassinations reveal a pattern so consistent it's almost mathematical. The higher the stakes, the thinner the line between ruler and target. From the Senate floors of Rome to the sun-baked courtyards of Persia, the same forces played out again and again, ambition unchecked by morality, loyalty eroded by opportunity, and the terrifying speed with which a trusted ally could become an executioner. The lesson etched into these stories isn't just about the past, it's a mirror held up to human nature itself. Consider the parallels that stretch across centuries. A Julius Caesar, struck down by men he pardoned, finds his echo in a Domitian, butchered by the servants who dressed him. A Cleopatra, her death shrouded in ambiguity, shares eerie similarities with a Numerian, his corpse hidden in a litter until the stench betrayed the truth. These weren't isolated acts of violence, they were symptoms of a system where power had no peaceful transfer mechanism. Without elections or term limits, the only way out was often through a dagger's thrust or a cup of poisoned wine. Yet for all their brutality, these assassinations failed as often as they succeeded. The conspirators who killed Caesar dreamed of restoring the Republic, only to hand absolute power to Augustus. The Praetorians who auctioned Pertinax's throne unleashed civil war, not stability. Time and again, the removal of a tyrant created a vacuum, inviting chaos rather than order. This is the grim irony of political violence. It rarely achieves what the killers intend. The very act of seizing power by force sets a precedent, teaching the next generation that ambition justifies brutality. What makes these stories resonate today isn't just their drama, it's their uncomfortable relevance. Modern leaders may not face literal daggers, but the mechanisms of betrayal persist. Backroom deals, character assassinations, the quiet undermining of rivals. The difference lies in the stakes. Where ancient murders could collapse empires, today's power struggles play out in boardrooms and ballot boxes. Yet the human impulses remain unchanged. The hunger for control, the fear of overthrow, the temptation to sacrifice ethics for advantage. Perhaps the most chilling lesson is how easily power corrupts its wielders. Nero began his reign as Rome's golden boy. Caligula was once the darling of the legions. Absolute authority, it seems, warps even the best intentions. This is why systems matter, why checks and balances, however imperfect, are the only bulwark against the cycle of violence. The ancient world lacked these safeguards, and its history became a graveyard of fallen kings. As the historian Tacitus once wrote, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. But he might have added that the more absolute the power, the more inevitable the bloodshed. These 30 assassinations are more than just history, they're a warning, a reminder that power, when concentrated and unaccountable, becomes a poison for those who hold it and for those who live under it. If these stories have gripped you, imagine what other dark corners of history we've yet to explore. From forgotten coups to whispered palace intrigues, the past is full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Hit subscribe now and join us as we keep pulling back the curtain on history's most shocking, twisted, and unforgettable moments. The next revelation is just one click